The shooting range on the outskirts of town was one of those places where time seemed to fold in on itself, where the smell of gunpowder lingered in the air long after the shots had stopped and the metallic clang of brass casings hitting the concrete floor echoed in memory more than in reality, and that was the setting where I first saw her. A woman who carried herself in such a disarmingly ordinary way that she seemed almost invisible in the crowd of men and women who came to practice there. Aim on that humid Saturday morning, the kind of woman you'd pass at the grocery store without noticing, the kind of neighbor who might wave politely from across the street but never linger long enough to spark curiosity, and yet something about her that day would change the entire tone of the range, something about her would bring a decorated Navy SEAL, a man used to seeing the limits of human precision and discipline, to a point of stunned silence. Though at that moment none of us could have guessed it. I had gone there myself for practice, slipping into the comfortable rhythm of loading magazines, fitting my protective glasses, and watching the instructors make their rounds with the new shooters, offering corrections on grip, stance, breathing. But she didn't stand out in any way, wearing a plain gray hoodie that looked almost too warm for the weather, dark jeans, sneakers with faint scuff marks. Her hair tied back in a ponytail that was more practical than stylish, and she carried no expensive gear or flashy rifle case like some of the regulars who wanted everyone to know how much money they spent on their hobbies. She had a rented Glock in her hands, the kind they gave to first-timers who didn't bring their own, and her uncertain way of checking the chamber, glancing at the safety, and holding it gingerly made me assume she was exactly that, a first-timer, maybe dragged along by a friend, maybe trying something new on a whim, one of countless people who come once, put a few holes in the target, and never return. The SEAL, though we didn't call him that at first, was already on his lane, working methodically with a custom-built SIG Sauer, the kind of weapon that looked like an extension of his hand, his stance so grounded it seemed like he grew out of the concrete beneath his boots, and he didn't waste a movement, every shot tight, every cluster a near-perfect group. The kind of shooting that made heads turn down the row because even among the experienced shooters there weren't many who could maintain that kind of control for long strings without drifting. He had the quiet presence of someone who didn't need to prove himself but did anyway simply by existing in that space, a man carved from discipline, the faint scars on his forearms, the squared jaw, the steady breathing pattern, all speaking to a life lived under pressure, though I only learned later that his name was Mark and that his years of service had taken him places most of us only ever saw in movies. At that moment he was simply the best shot in the building, the kind of presence you measured yourself against without realizing it. And so when the woman in gray shuffled uncertainly into the lane beside him, setting down the rental pistol with an almost apologetic motion, he didn't even glance her way at first, too focused on his own rhythm, but I noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw when she fired her first magazine. The first shots were exactly what everyone expected, scattered, uneven, a little low and left, the mark of someone still learning to control the trigger pull, and she even flinched at the recoil, her shoulders jerking slightly with each report, making the casing bounce awkwardly off the partition wall, and I could see the quiet satisfaction on the face of one of the instructors watching from behind, because beginners like her kept his job relevant, gave him a chance to step in, to correct, to guide. But she didn't ask for help, didn't even acknowledge his presence, simply reloaded with an almost mechanical calm, her fingers slow but precise, and on the second magazine something subtle shifted, so subtle most people missed it, but I didn't. Her shoulders relaxed, her grip tightened into the kind of locked-in control you only see after hours of muscle memory training, and her stance widened a half-inch, bringing her balance lower, grounding her, her breathing slowed until it matched the pace of the Navy SEAL beside her, and the next set of shots landed closer, 3 holes near the center ring, not perfect but deliberate, and then the next string cut even closer, 5 clustered shots that nearly tore into one another, and by the third magazine there was no mistaking it. This woman wasn't learning, she was remembering. Her initial awkwardness had been nothing but a mask, a carefully worn costume of inexperience, and as it fell away, the instructors stopped hovering, the chatter down the row softened, and even Mark, the SEAL, glanced sideways for the first time, his rhythm breaking for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing in disbelief at the target she reeled in. It was almost pristine, a pattern so tight it could have passed for a single ragged hole, and she hadn't even seemed to strain for it, hadn't puffed out her chest or smiled at her own success the way most shooters did when they surprised themselves. She had simply reloaded again, eyes forward, jaw clenched, as if this was routine, as if this was her default. That was when the silence spread, the kind that fills a room without warning, as others started noticing, one by one, the ordinary woman in the hoodie who was suddenly rewriting the unspoken hierarchy of the range. I felt my own chest tighten watching it, because there was something uncanny in the way she moved, the way her aim seemed more like instinct than practice, the way her every adjustment mirrored habits drilled into soldiers, not civilians, and though I didn't yet know who she was or what story she carried, I knew enough to recognize that whatever she had lived through before stepping into this range was something far removed from the life she seemed to project on the surface. The Navy SEAL must have felt the same, because after her fourth magazine he stepped back, cleared his weapon, and leaned slightly over the partition, not with arrogance but with the wary curiosity of someone who had just seen something impossible, and in that instant the range wasn't just a place for practice anymore, it had become a stage, and she had revealed herself not as an ordinary woman but as something else entirely, though none of us yet knew how far that revelation would go. Mark didn't speak immediately, and that silence carried more weight than words could have, because the Navy SEAL's reaction wasn't the laughter or condescension you might expect when a supposed amateur suddenly showed unexpected skill. It was the watchful stillness of a predator who had just sensed another predator nearby, a moment of recognition that what he thought was his territory might not belong to him alone, and for a few seconds he studied her with the kind of analysis you could almost feel in the air, the kind of gaze that stripped away surface appearances to probe for the hidden truth, while she continued as if unaware, though I was convinced by then that she knew exactly what kind of attention she was drawing. She fired again, each movement seamless, each grouping tighter, until her target looked like the aftermath of a surgeon's scalpel rather than a scattered amateur's trial, and when she finally set the pistol down, exhaling in a slow, steady breath that didn't match the nerves of a beginner, Mark finally broke the silence with a comment so simple yet sharp enough to cut through the hum of the ventilation system. "That's not your first time." She turned her head slowly, not startled, not defensive, just meeting his eyes with a calm that almost unsettled me more than her shooting had, and with the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips she replied, "Does it matter?" It was a deflection, but not the kind that dismissed him, it was the kind that invited him to keep probing, to step into a game where the rules weren't obvious, and though I didn't know Mark personally I could tell this was the sort of challenge he wasn't used to receiving outside the confines of military life, where most people either admired him, deferred to him, or tried to avoid confrontation altogether. The instructors were pretending not to watch, but I could see their heads turning ever so slightly, their curiosity piqued by the exchange, and I wasn't alone in my anticipation that something unusual was about to unfold. She loaded another magazine, deliberate and unhurried, while Mark slid back into his stance, though now his shots weren't just for himself, they were for her, each squeeze of the trigger a silent declaration that he was still the best on this range, still the man who could command respect through skill alone. But this time her rhythm matched his exactly, as if she were tracing his breath, syncing with his pace, and when the targets reeled back again the contrast wasn't what anyone expected. His groupings were impressive as always, near flawless, but hers were indistinguishable, so tight that you'd need calipers to measure any difference, and for the first time I saw Mark's composure falter, just slightly, a tightening of the jaw, a shift of weight that betrayed the tiniest fracture in his confidence. She noticed it too, and though she didn't gloat, the quiet confidence radiating from her posture was louder than any words could have been. I leaned closer, almost forgetting my own weapon resting on the counter, because what was unfolding between them wasn't just practice, it was a duel, a silent clash of mastery disguised as casual shooting, and everyone nearby was aware of it, though none dared to interrupt. After another 2 rounds each, Mark finally lowered his pistol again, stepping back and crossing his arms, watching her with a look I recognized as respect reluctantly given, the kind a professional reserves for another professional, and then, in a voice lower than before but edged with curiosity, he asked, "Army? Marine? Law enforcement?" She shook her head once, a brief dismissal, and then answered in that same composed tone, "None of the above." That answer should have ended the conversation, but instead it deepened the mystery, because if she wasn't military or law enforcement, how could she shoot like that, how could she move with that muscle memory, that instinct, that undeniable presence of training? I could almost feel the gears turning in Mark's head as he studied her further, as if he were trying to place her in some unspoken catalogue of people he had known, people who could shoot, people who could kill if they had to, and though the atmosphere around us was still casual enough to seem normal to an outsider, those of us who were tuned in knew something unordinary was happening. She didn't flinch under his stare, didn't rush to explain herself, simply ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and set the pistol down neatly, as if to signal that she had no more to prove, and then she removed her protective glasses, revealing eyes that were sharper, colder than anyone expected, eyes that didn't belong to an ordinary neighbor or hobbyist but to someone forged by fire most of us couldn't imagine. Mark let out a faint breath, almost like a laugh but not quite, and said, "You're not here by accident." She tilted her head at him, considering the remark, and then replied, "Neither are you." That subtle volley hit harder than gunfire, because it wasn't just about the shooting anymore, It was about the unspoken recognition between two people who had both lived lives shaped by precision, by discipline, by danger, and though they had never met before, they both knew they were no longer strangers. The rest of us were spectators now, witnesses to something electric, and I couldn't help but feel that this meeting wasn't coincidence, that perhaps she had come here not just to shoot, not just to practice, but to reveal something, to someone like him, to someone who could understand. The air smelled sharper now, the echoes of gunfire hanging like ghosts between them, and though nothing dramatic had happened yet, I had the strange certainty that this moment was only the beginning of a story that would stretch far beyond the shooting range, a story that neither Mark nor the mysterious woman in grey could walk away from unchanged. The weight of their exchange lingered long after the sound of gunfire faded, and though the other shooters tried to go back to their routines, the atmosphere had shifted in a way none of us could ignore, because the woman in grey had revealed just enough to unsettle everyone yet not enough to satisfy the gnawing curiosity she had awakened, and Mark, for all his composure, was clearly wrestling with the same need to know more, though his years of training kept him from pressing too hard, at least not yet, and I found myself caught in the middle of it, watching every gesture, every pause, as though the smallest clue might explain who she really was and how she had come to possess skills that rivaled, maybe even surpassed, those of a decorated Navy SEAL. She finally stepped away from the lane, her movements smooth, deliberate, almost ceremonial as she returned the rented Glock to the counter, signed her initials on the clipboard with a neat hand, and slid her protective gear back into the plastic bin, and it was only then that I realized how quiet the range had grown, how many eyes were subtly tracking her, how even the instructors, who normally barked corrections or warnings, were silent as though under some unspoken spell. Mark followed her with his gaze, his jaw tight, his posture steady, and then, as if pulled by an invisible tether, he set his own weapon down and mirrored her actions, clearing it with the precision of ritual before stepping away from his lane. I could feel something brewing, something unscripted, because their interaction wasn't done, not by a long shot, and the thought stirred a tension in me that made my heart race faster than the gunfire ever had. Outside the shooting bay, the lounge area smelled faintly of coffee and solvent, a place where people usually cooled down, compared targets, bragged or complained, but when she walked in, the room seemed to reline itself around her presence, conversations lowering, glances flickering, and she didn't so much as pause to acknowledge them. She simply moved to the corner table, set down her bag, which I realized now was smaller than most, barely large enough to carry anything beyond essentials, and poured herself a paper cup of water. Mark entered a moment later, and though he could have walked past, could have left, he didn't. Instead, he angled toward her with the kind of determination that suggested this was no longer about idle curiosity but about something deeper. Something that demanded resolution. I moved with them, not intentionally, but because I couldn't resist, and I wasn't alone. 2 instructors lingered near the counter, a pair of hobbyists found reasons to delay leaving, and even the clerk behind the register leaned on his elbows with a look of anticipation. Mark stood by her table for a long second before speaking, his voice measured but carrying the weight of command. That's military precision, whether you admit it or not. She didn't look up right away, sipping her water slowly, as if letting the silence speak first, and then she met his eyes and answered, "And what would you know about military precision?" He didn't flinch, didn't smile, simply replied, "Enough to recognize it." The moment stretched, a taut rope between them, and I almost expected her to break it with a laugh, a shrug, an excuse, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing slightly, and said, "Recognition doesn't mean understanding." That subtle pushback seemed to intrigue him even more, because instead of pressing, he pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down, something about the gesture both casual and deliberate, as though he had accepted her challenge and was prepared to play her game by her rules. Their conversation dropped to a lower register, but I was close enough to catch pieces of it, each word loaded, each pause heavy, and I felt almost guilty for eavesdropping but not guilty enough to stop. He asked her where she trained, she deflected. He asked her what unit she served with, she denied. He asked her why she hid her skill, she countered by asking why he flaunted his. Back and forth they went, 2 blades testing each other's edges, and with each exchange I became more convinced that she wasn't just skilled, she was dangerous, not in the reckless sense but in the way of someone who had lived in shadows, someone who carried history like a concealed weapon. Finally, when Mark asked her directly, "What's your story?" she gave the faintest smile and replied, "Stories are for people who need to explain themselves. I don't." That was the closest thing to an answer he would get, at least then, and though I half expected him to press harder, he surprised me by leaning back, folding his arms, and letting out a soft chuckle, the kind that carried not mockery but respect. "Fair enough," he said, and for the first time since their duel began, the tension eased, Not dissolved but shifted into something else, something that felt less like opposition and more like recognition, as if they had both acknowledged a truth neither was willing to state aloud. She finished her water, stood, and with a nod that was almost too subtle to notice, walked out of the lounge, leaving behind a silence that seemed louder than the gunfire had ever been, and Mark sat there for a moment longer, staring at the door, his mind clearly turning over what he had just encountered. Then, almost as if realizing he had an audience, he glanced around, catching the stares of those who had been watching, and with a faint smirk he said, "She's better than she looks." It was the understatement of the day, but it was also an admission, and coming from him, a man whose reputation preceded him even without introduction, it meant everything. I didn't know if I would ever see her again, didn't know if this was the end of the story or the beginning, but something deep in my gut told me it wasn't over, not for her, not for Mark, and certainly not for those of us who had witnessed it, because once you see the mask of ordinariness slip away to reveal something extraordinary, you can't forget it, can't unsee it, and you find yourself waiting, wondering, when that revelation will surface again. The next time I saw her was not at the shooting range but in the most unexpected of places, a small downtown diner that smelled of fried onions and burnt coffee, the kind of unremarkable establishment where people went not for atmosphere but for familiarity, where the clatter of plates and the squeak of vinyl booths created a background hum of ordinary life, and yet seeing her there made the air feel anything but ordinary, because as soon as she walked in, every detail of the first encounter at the range rushed back like a tide, the precision, the calm, the unshakable mystery that clung to her presence, and I realized in that moment that perhaps her ordinariness was the most carefully constructed illusion I had ever witnessed, a disguise worn so well it fooled strangers but failed to erase the truth from those who had glimpsed it even once. She entered wearing the same kind of plain clothes, jeans, and a dark jacket that looked more functional than stylish, her hair pulled back in a simple braid this time, but her eyes, those eyes that had unsettled a Navy SEAL, still carried the same piercing clarity, and though she moved with the casualness of someone stepping in for lunch, I noticed the way she scanned the room first, a flicker of assessment that came too quickly for most people to notice, cataloging exits, angles, potential threats, the ingrained habits of someone who had learned long ago that safety is an illusion maintained only by constant vigilance. I had been sitting 2 booths away, half buried in a plate of eggs and toast, when I froze, torn between pretending not to see her and acknowledging her presence, but before I could decide, another figure walked in, Mark, the Navy SEAL, wearing civilian clothes this time but carrying the same unmistakable posture, the kind of stance that screamed discipline even in a setting where discipline seemed out of place, and when his eyes landed on her, I saw that same spark of recognition light up, the same unspoken pull that had bound them together at the range. He didn't hesitate, didn't play coy, he walked straight over to her booth as though he had been expecting her, though I knew enough to sense that this was no planned meeting. And when he stopped at her table, she looked up from the menu she had only just opened and gave him a half smile that was equal parts acknowledgement and amusement, as if to say, "Of course you'd show up." He slid into the booth across from her without asking, and though some part of me felt like I was intruding on something private, I couldn't stop watching, drawn in by the invisible current that seemed to hum between them. The waitress came by, oblivious to the undercurrent, refilled their water glasses, and shuffled away, and only then did Mark speak, his voice steady but edged with something sharper this time. "You didn't answer me last time. Who are you?" She stirred her water with the straw, not drinking, her eyes locked on his, and then replied with the same evasive calm as before, "Someone you don't need to know." But this time Mark didn't let the answer pass. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and said, "You don't shoot like that without a past, and I don't believe in coincidences. So either you tell me, or I start digging." Her smile faded then, not into fear but into something colder, a warning as sharp as a drawn blade, and she said softly, "Digging into my life is a dangerous choice." That reply didn't intimidate him, but it sobered him, made him pause, because even a man like him, who had faced enemies on battlefields across the world, recognized the weight in her words, the kind of weight that doesn't come from bluffing but from lived experience, from scars invisible to the naked eye. For a long moment they stared at each other across the cheap diner table, two forces testing the boundary between curiosity and danger, and I realized I was holding my breath, unable to look away. Finally Mark eased back, not surrendering but conceding just enough ground to keep the conversation alive, and he said, "Fine. Don't tell me your past. But you're not just some civilian, and we both know it. So what are you doing here?" She tilted her head slightly, considering the question, and for the first time her expression softened, not into warmth but into something like resignation, as though she knew resistance was pointless, and she said, "Trying to live a life that doesn't follow me." The way she said it chilled me, because it implied more than she revealed, suggested shadows, pursuits, ghosts that trailed her no matter where she went, and Mark's eyes narrowed as though he caught the same undertone. "You think you can outrun it?" he asked. She gave a faint shake of her head. "Not outrun. Survive." That word carried a weight that silenced even the clatter of dishes in my mind, because survival isn't the language of people who live ordinary lives, it's the language of those who have been hunted, tested, cornered, and though she didn't expand on it, the diner suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, the world sharper. Mark studied her for a long moment, and then he said something that surprised me, "Then maybe you shouldn't do it alone." She blinked, the faintest crack in her armor, a flicker of surprise that someone like him would offer that instead of pressing harder, and though she didn't respond right away, I could tell his words had landed somewhere deeper than she wanted to admit. The waitress returned with coffee, breaking the tension, and as they both reached for their cups, I realized that whatever game had begun between them at the range was now evolving into something far more dangerous, far more consequential, and I had the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of a story that none of us could predict. The end of the offer hung in the air between them, not spoken with the arrogance of a man who believed he could save her, nor with the pity of someone offering charity, but with the steady conviction of a soldier who had learned that survival, in its truest sense, is rarely accomplished alone, and for a moment I thought she might laugh at him, dismiss the suggestion with the same cool detachment she had used to parry his earlier questions, but instead she just sat there, eyes locked on his, silent, calculating, as though weighing not the words themselves but the man who spoke them, testing his sincerity, his resilience, his capacity to withstand whatever storm clung to her past. The diner bustled around them, the clang of dishes, the chatter of strangers, but none of it seemed to penetrate the cocoon of tension that wrapped the booth where they sat, and from where I watched, my half-finished breakfast forgotten, I realized that what I was witnessing was less a conversation than a negotiation, an unspoken bargaining of two people who had both lived too close to violence, both carried the weight of secrets they weren't ready to reveal, and though I could only guess at the details, I knew instinctively that their stories were converging in a way that would not allow either of them to walk away unchanged. She finally broke the silence with a question, her tone steady but edged with something sharp. "Why would you even care? You don't know me." Mark didn't hesitate, his answer quick and simple, "Because I know what it looks like when someone's trying to disappear, and I know what it costs." That reply seemed to hit her harder than any direct demand could have, because for the first time her eyes flickered, just briefly, as if betraying some internal struggle, and she looked down at her coffee cup, fingers tightening around the ceramic edge as though grounding herself before she responded. "You think offering yourself makes it easier?" she asked, her voice lower now, almost more to herself than to him. "It doesn't. It just paints a bigger target." Mark leaned forward again, his tone calm but firm, the tone of someone accustomed to giving orders but softened by something more personal now. "I've lived my life as a target. That doesn't scare me. What does is watching someone like you pretend they can shoulder it alone." For a moment I thought she might finally break, finally reveal some piece of her history, but instead she gave him the faintest smile, a tired smile, and said, "You don't scare easy, do you?" He smirked faintly in return. "Neither do you." That small exchange shifted something, a subtle crack in the wall she had built, and though she still didn't offer explanations, didn't tell him who she was or why she carried the kind of training she clearly had, she also didn't shut him out entirely, and in the silence that followed I sensed an unspoken agreement forming, one that didn't require words but carried its own gravity nonetheless. She pushed her coffee aside, stood, and with a motion that was almost too casual said, "Walk with me." Mark rose without hesitation, as though he had known she would ask, and they moved toward the door together, her stride measured, his steady, and I found myself scrambling to drop a few bills on my table and follow at a discreet distance, compelled not by nosiness but by the undeniable sense that something important was unfolding and I couldn't let it vanish into the ordinary rhythms of the city. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalks, and the air carried that faint tang of asphalt and exhaust, but the street felt sharper, charged, as I trailed them just far enough back to hear fragments of their exchange. "So what's the plan?" Mark asked, his tone almost casual, though I knew it wasn't. "Plan?" she repeated, with a small laugh that sounded more bitter than amused. "You make it sound like I'm recruiting." "Aren't you?" he countered. She stopped walking then, turned to look at him fully, and for a moment her eyes darkened in a way that made my chest tighten, as though some truth threatened to surface before she buried it again. "I'm trying not to be found," she said simply, her voice low and hard. "That's the plan." Mark studied her carefully, and then asked the question that had been hanging since the range, "By who?" She didn't answer immediately, her gaze sliding past him to scan the street, and I followed her eyes to see nothing but a man walking his dog, a pair of teenagers skateboarding, a woman pushing a stroller, all perfectly normal, yet her posture remained tense, her shoulders tight, her stance ready, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't with details but with a warning, the kind of people you don't want to know. That answer hung heavier than silence, because it suggested not just enemies but an entire world lurking beneath the surface of the one we all inhabited, and though Mark didn't flinch, I could see his jaw tighten, his mind already parsing possibilities. They walked on, their steps falling into rhythm, and I followed, careful to keep my distance, though I knew at any moment she might notice me, and I wondered what she would do if she did, whether she would confront me, dismiss me, or simply vanish into some unseen network of escape routes I couldn't even imagine. Yet for reasons I didn't fully understand, she allowed my presence that day, her attention fixed more on Mark, and as they turned down a quieter street lined with old brick buildings, I realized that whatever game had begun between them was no longer confined to the sterile walls of a shooting range or the safe pretense of a diner booth, it had spilled into the real world, where shadows stretched long and danger might be hiding in every corner, and though neither of them said it aloud, I knew the alliance they were forming, fragile, tenuous, unspoken, was about to be tested in ways neither of them could yet predict. They reached the end of the quiet street, where the brick buildings gave way to an empty lot overrun with weeds and rusted fencing, and she stopped abruptly, scanning the space with the same calculated precision she had shown at the range, her body shifting subtly as if testing wind direction, sound, and movement all at once, and I knew instantly that this was more than a walk, it was a check, a measure of safety, a pause to determine whether they were being followed, and though I hung back half a block away, trying to blend into the lazy rhythm of the city, I realized she had known about me all along, because her eyes flicked toward my position, holding for the briefest second before returning to Mark as though making a mental note but choosing not to act, which told me something even more unsettling. She didn't consider me a threat, or worse, she had already calculated how to deal with me if I became one. Mark noticed her pause too, his hand instinctively brushing the side of his jacket where a weapon might have been, though he wasn't carrying today, and he asked quietly, "You expecting company?" She shook her head once, not in denial but in that vague way that suggested the opposite, that she was always expecting company, even if unseen. "You need to understand something," she said then, her voice firmer now, edged with steel. "Whatever picture you have in your head about me, it's worse." Mark didn't flinch, instead he took a half step closer, his voice low and steady. "I've seen worse." She gave him a long look, as if measuring whether that was arrogance or truth, and then sighed, her shoulders dropping just slightly, a rare crack in her composure. "You think you want to be involved, but once you are, there's no stepping back." His reply came instantly, without hesitation. "I don't step back." The simplicity of his conviction seemed to hang between them, and for a moment neither spoke, the only sound the distant rumble of traffic and the faint creak of the rusted fence swaying in the breeze, until she finally said, "Then you'd better be ready." With that she turned, leading him toward a narrow alley that cut between the buildings, and I followed at a careful distance, my heart pounding not just from the pace but from the sense that I was shadowing something far larger than myself, something that might soon spiral into a world I wasn't meant to see. The alley smelled of damp concrete and old trash, but she moved through it with unerring certainty, her stride steady, unhesitant, and Mark matched her step for step, his body language calm but alert, and when they emerged on the far side, where a row of derelict warehouses stood like skeletons of another age, she stopped again, this time pulling something from her jacket pocket. A small black key card that caught the light as she held it up briefly before sliding it against a barely visible reader set into one of the rusted doors. With a soft click the lock disengaged, and she pushed the door open, stepping into darkness. Mark hesitated only for a second before following her inside, and after a pause that stretched long enough to make me doubt my own sanity, I slipped in behind them, careful to keep to the shadows. The interior was unexpected, not abandoned as the exterior suggested but meticulously maintained, a hidden refuge with clean concrete floors, stacked crates, and a long workbench lined with tools, weapons, and files spread out in precise order, and the air carried the faint metallic tang of oil and steel. She flicked on a single overhead light, bathing the room in a harsh glow, and for the first time I saw her without the camouflage of ordinary life. Here, in this hidden place, she looked like what she truly was, not a civilian, not a casual shooter, but someone who had lived her life preparing for war. Mark's eyes swept the space, taking it all in with the quick assessment of a man trained to evaluate safe houses, and I saw in his expression a rare flicker of recognition, maybe even admiration. "So," he said finally, "this is who you are." She didn't answer immediately, instead crossing to the workbench and picking up a folder, sliding it across the surface toward him. "This is who's looking for me." Mark opened the folder, and though I couldn't see the contents from where I stood, the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders stiffened, told me enough. "These aren't amateurs," he said quietly. She nodded once. "No. And they don't stop." He flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each one, and then looked back at her. "You've been running." "Surviving," she corrected sharply. "And every time I think I've put enough distance between us, they find me again." She leaned against the workbench, her eyes cold now. "That's why I stay ordinary. That's why I disappear. Because the moment I stand out, they see me." Mark closed the folder slowly, his mind clearly racing, and then he said, "You're not going to shake them by hiding forever. You know that." She didn't argue, didn't deny it, and in her silence I saw the truth. She knew exactly what he meant, knew that sooner or later running would no longer be enough, that eventually survival would demand something more. "So what do you suggest?" she asked finally, her voice hard but tinged with something else, maybe exhaustion, maybe reluctant hope. Mark set the folder down and met her eyes squarely. "We stop running." The words hung heavy in the room, a declaration of intent, a challenge, a promise, and though she didn't respond right away, the flicker in her eyes betrayed the crack in her walls, the spark of something shifting deep inside. For the first time since I had met her, she looked not just like someone surviving but like someone on the edge of reclaiming control, and though she didn't say yes, didn't commit, she didn't dismiss it either, and that silence spoke louder than words. The silence between them stretched long, waited with everything unsaid, until she finally pushed off the workbench and began pacing slowly, each step deliberate, controlled, but her hands betrayed her, curling and uncurling at her sides as if she were holding back a tide of conflicting impulses, and when she spoke again her voice carried both the bite of defiance and the weariness of someone who had lived too long with her guard up. "You don't understand, stopping them isn't simple, it isn't just a matter of firepower or courage. These people operate in shadows, they erase obstacles, they erase entire lives, and they don't stop until there's nothing left. Not even a memory to prove you existed." Yet Mark didn't waver, his stance rooted. His tone steady as he counted. "Then they picked the wrong person this time, because you're still here, still breathing, still fighting, and that means you've already beaten them more times than they expected," which drew from her the faintest, almost imperceptible laugh, dry and sharp like glass cracking under pressure, as if the absurdity of hope in the face of relentless pursuit was too much to take seriously, but in her eyes I caught a glimmer of something else, something fragile, as though his stubborn refusal to accept defeat had nudged a part of her she had buried deep. She stopped pacing then, leaning forward on the workbench, her knuckles whitening against the steel surface, and asked flatly, "Why are you even here? You don't owe me anything, you don't even know me," to which Mark replied without hesitation, "Because I do know you, I've trained enough shooters, fought alongside enough operators, to recognize someone who carries more than their share of ghosts, and I don't walk away from people like that, not when I can help." And though his words were blunt, there was a raw honesty in them that made her finally lift her head, locking eyes with him. And for the first time she didn't look guarded, didn't look like she was calculating an exit, she just looked human, tired, vulnerable, yet still burning with a fire that no amount of running had extinguished. She took a long breath, steadying herself, and then with sudden resolve began pulling open drawers along the workbench, revealing caches of weapons, maps, encrypted devices, and files thick with surveillance photos, each one carefully organized, each one a fragment of the war she had been waging alone, and she slid one of the thicker folders across to him, saying simply, "Then if you're staying, you need to see what you're up against." Mark opened it, flipping through page after page of names, faces, locations, patterns of movement, and as he read the scope of it became clear, not a handful of pursuers, not a rogue cell, but an entire network spanning borders, a machine built to hunt and erase, and his face hardened as he closed the file with deliberate calm, placing it back on the bench as though sealing a pact. "You've been fighting this alone," he said, not as a question but as a grim acknowledgement, and she nodded once, silent, her jaw tight. "Not anymore," he added, and though she didn't thank him, didn't soften, she didn't reject it either, and that acceptance was as close to trust as anyone had likely earned from her in years. She moved to a crate in the corner then, pulling out a long case, and when she unlatched it the overhead light gleamed across the polished barrel of a sniper rifle, custom, precise, the kind of weapon that spoke of countless hours of dedication, and she handled it with a reverence that revealed more about her than any words could, because here in her hands, with the weight of the rifle settling against her shoulder, she wasn't hiding, wasn't ordinary. She was exactly who she was meant to be, and Mark saw it too, his eyes narrowing with recognition, his voice low as he asked, "You were never just a target, were you? You were one of them." For a heartbeat she froze, then lowered the weapon carefully back into the case, snapping it shut with a metallic finality, and when she spoke her tone was flat but unflinching. "Once. A long time ago. Until I became inconvenient." The pieces clicked into place, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized she wasn't simply a civilian caught in the crosshairs, she had been on the inside, part of the very machine that now hunted her, and that revelation shifted everything, turned the chase into something far more dangerous, because if she had once belonged to them, she carried knowledge, skills, secrets, the kind of liability that a shadow network would burn the world to eliminate. Mark didn't recoil, didn't accuse, he only nodded slowly, the flicker of understanding in his eyes deepening into something more solid, like respect tempered by gravity. "Then we hit them where it hurts," he said simply, as if it were the most natural conclusion, and she tilted her head, studying him for a long moment before replying, "You don't even know what that means yet." His answer came with quiet conviction. "Then show me." And in that exchange, in that fragile thread of alignment forged between two people carrying different scars from the same kind of war, the air in the warehouse seemed to shift, as if a line had been crossed, as if the moment of endless running had given way to the possibility of standing ground. I stayed frozen in my shadowed corner, my pulse hammering, because I knew then that whatever was about to unfold would be bigger than anything I had imagined, and that I was no longer just a bystander. I was standing at the edge of a storm that could swallow us all. The night outside the warehouse had deepened into a velvet black, the hum of the city fading into a low, distant murmur as though the world itself had pulled back to make room for what was about to happen, and in that stillness she began laying out the plan, her voice steady, clipped, each word sharpened by years of operational discipline, while Mark listened intently, his arms folded, his expression carved into the calm focus of a man who had walked into impossible odds before and lived to tell about them. And though I stood on the periphery, half hidden, half terrified, I realized that I was no longer just an observer but a witness to the birth of something dangerous and unbreakable, an alliance forged not by choice but by necessity. She spread the maps across the workbench, tracing routes with her finger, pointing to marks that denoted safe houses, weapons caches, and known operatives, and as the layers of her secret war unfolded it became clear that what she carried wasn't just survival instinct, it was intelligence, raw and lethal, the kind of knowledge that entire agencies would kill to possess, and now, with Mark at her side, it was about to be used offensively for the first time. Mark asked questions only where necessary, his experience filling the gaps without explanation, and together they began shaping the chaos into something surgical, something that could strike at the network without giving them time to recover, and though her face remained impassive, I could see the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders seemed to ease slightly, as if sharing the burden had carved away a fraction of the weight she had carried alone for so long. Hours bled into one another, the warehouse lit only by the harsh overhead lights and the glow of screens, until finally she closed the final file and looked directly at him, her eyes sharp and unyielding, and said, "If we do this, there's no going back. They'll burn everything to ash to get to us." Mark didn't flinch, didn't even hesitate, replying with the simplicity of truth, "Then we make sure they don't get the chance," and something in that unwavering conviction anchored the moment, solidified the decision into something real, irreversible. She inhaled slowly, as though drawing the first true breath in years, then began packing the files, the weapons, the devices, each motion methodical, preparing for the war that was no longer just hers. Dawn crept in by the time they were finished, pale light seeping through cracks in the boarded windows, painting long slashes across the concrete floor, and when she finally slung the rifle case across her back and turned to face him, there was no hesitation left in her, no doubt, only the clarity of someone who had chosen to fight on her own terms. They left the warehouse together, stepping into the gray morning with the air sharp and cool around them, and for a moment it struck me how ordinary they looked, two figures disappearing into the city streets, carrying with them the weight of a war no one else could see, and yet within that ordinariness lay the extraordinary, the kind of quiet defiance that changed the course of things unseen.